The music, the glittering costumes, the unforgettable hairstyles. There has only ever been one ABBA, and at the very heart of this legend stands Benny Andersson, the man whose melodies have moved millions for decades. Alongside his bandmates, he created songs that became the soundtrack of generations. But behind the spotlight and record-breaking success were breakups, hard choices, and personal struggles few ever knew about. Now at 78, Benny looks back and finally shares the truth, not only about himself and his journey, but also about what truly remains of ABBA, half a century after their greatest triumphs. Benny Andersson's story begins in Stockholm, Sweden, on December 16, 1946. Born into a modest family, his father Gustav worked as a civil engineer, while his mother Lila devoted herself to raising Benny and his younger sister Eva-Lise. But it wasn't careers or academics that shaped young Benny's path. It was music flowing through the family's veins. His father and grandfather both played the accordion, and when Benny turned 6, they placed one in his hands. What began as simple folk tunes and traditional Swedish melodies quickly grew into an obsession. Soon he was captivated not only by folk music but also by the booming sounds of international stars. Records by Katarina Valente and Elvis Presley became his treasures, with Elvis's Treat Me Nice sparking a lifelong love for the piano hidden in the background of the track. At 10, Benny received his very first piano, and without formal lessons he taught himself to play. By his teenage years, his passion for music had fully eclipsed his interest in school. He left his studies behind at just 15, choosing instead to perform in youth clubs, honing both his confidence and his craft. It was during this time that he also experienced his first taste of love with Christina Gronvall, who would later become the mother of his 2 children, Peter and Helen. Between raising a young family and pursuing his earliest musical experiments, Benny was already walking a road that combined personal challenges with artistic ambition. This blend of responsibility, raw talent, and restless creativity was the foundation of everything that would follow. The boy with the accordion was on his way to becoming one of the most influential composers in pop history. By the early 1960s, Benny Andersson was no longer just a boy fascinated by melodies. He was a restless teenager searching for his place in Sweden's fast-changing music scene. Rock and roll had arrived from America, British beat groups were beginning to dominate Europe, and Swedish youth were hungry for a sound they could call their own. That chance came in 1964, when Benny joined the Hep Stars as their keyboardist. The Hep Stars were already on the cusp of success, but Benny's arrival proved to be the missing piece. Just a few months later, in March 1965, the band released Cadillac, and almost instantly they were propelled to national stardom. With screaming fans, television appearances, and sold-out concerts, they became known as the Swedish Beatles. For Benny, the sudden spotlight was dazzling. He was no longer the quiet boy at the piano. He was a teen idol, his face plastered across magazines, his every move followed by fans. Yet while he enjoyed the excitement, Benny was never fully comfortable with celebrity. Even in the midst of the frenzy, he often retreated into the world of songwriting, where he felt most at home. At first, the Hep Stars performed mostly cover versions of international hits, capitalizing on the wave of rock sweeping across Europe. But Benny's creative instincts urged him towards something original. He began composing for the group, and soon they were recording his songs. No Response, Sunny Girl, Wedding, Consolation, and She Will Love You. These tracks weren't just chart successes, they gave the Hep Stars their own identity and proved Benny's ability to craft melodies that stuck in people's minds. By the mid-1960s, Benny had become more than just a keyboard player. He was the band's driving musical force, shaping their sound from behind the keys, while also stepping into the role of songwriter and arranger. He learned how to blend catchy hooks with emotional depth, skills that would serve him far beyond the Hep Stars. The band's fame, however, came with its pressures. Constant touring, recording deadlines, and the whirlwind of teenage adoration could be overwhelming. Benny experienced firsthand the toll that fame could take on friendships and relationships, but it also steeled him for the challenges of the music industry, giving him both resilience and perspective. Still, something was missing. The Hep Stars had brought him recognition, but Benny yearned for a creative partner who could share his vision, someone who could help take his songwriting to the next level. That moment arrived in June 1966, when he crossed paths with a fellow musician named Bjorn. The meeting would not only alter Benny's career but also set in motion one of the most successful partnerships in pop history. The summer of 1966 was a turning point in Benny Andersson's life. By then, the Hep Stars had established themselves as Sweden's top pop group, while Bjorn Ulvaeus was finding success with his folk-oriented band, the Hootenanny Singers. Though their musical styles seemed worlds apart, one rooted in polished pop and rock, the other in traditional folk, the two young men instantly recognized something familiar in each other, a shared love of melody and storytelling. Their first collaboration was a modest song called Isn't It Easy to Say, recorded later by the Hep Stars. On the surface, it was just another pop tune, but for Benny and Bjorn, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. They discovered that their strengths complemented one another perfectly. Benny had an instinctive gift for crafting harmonies and memorable melodies, while Bjorn brought structure, lyrical precision, and storytelling to the table. In those early writing sessions, they often worked late into the night, scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper, playing with chords until something clicked, and laughing at the joy of discovery. It wasn't about fame or money then. It was about the thrill of creating something original together. Both men sensed they had stumbled onto a partnership that could last. By 1969, their growing collaboration started to pay off. The duo penned songs for other artists, including entries in Sweden's Melodifestivalen, the national competition for the Eurovision Song Contest. Their track Häggclown placed second in the 1969 edition, giving them a taste of the larger stage that awaited. That same year, fate intervened again, this time in their personal lives. Benny met Anni-Frid Lyngstad, a talented singer with a striking voice and presence, while Bjorn fell in love with another rising star, Agnetha Fältskog. Music and romance became intertwined, binding the four together in ways that went far beyond professional ambition. For Benny, Frida was more than a partner. She was a muse. He produced her single Peter Pan in 1969, and later her debut solo album Frida in 1971. Their musical chemistry mirrored their growing affection, and before long, the two had moved in together. As the 1970s dawned, Benny and Bjorn's creative bond deepened. Surrounded by two equally talented singers, they began to imagine the possibilities of combining their voices in harmony. At first, it was just casual collaboration, lending background vocals here and there. But soon it became clear that the blend of Agnetha and Frida's voices carried something magical, a sound that could define a new kind of group. The seeds of ABBA were quietly being planted. What began as a chance meeting between two young musicians in the mid-1960s was now evolving into a partnership that would soon reshape the landscape of pop music forever. By the early 1970s, the connection between Benny Andersson and Bjorn Ulvaeus had become unshakable. They were no longer simply writing songs for other artists. They were building a shared vision. And alongside them stood two women whose voices would transform their work into something truly timeless: Agnetha Fältskog and Anni-Frid Lyngstad. The personal and the professional began to intertwine in ways that would define the rest of their lives. Benny and Frida were now living together, while Bjorn and Agnetha had married in 1971. To the outside world, they seemed like two perfect couples, young, talented, and brimming with optimism. To those inside the circle, it was also a moment of immense creative possibility. At first, their collaborations were casual. Agnetha and Frida would provide backing vocals for Benny and Bjorn's recordings, lifting the songs with their distinctive blend of warmth and power. But as soon as the four sang together, something clicked. The mixture of Benny's ear for arrangement, Bjorn's lyrical clarity, and the contrasting yet complementary tones of Agnetha's crystal soprano and Frida's deeper, soulful alto created a sound unlike anything Sweden or the world had heard before. Their earliest performances as a quartet were informal. In 1970, during a trip to Cyprus, they entertained UN soldiers stationed there, turning a beach gathering into an impromptu concert. Later that year, they staged a cabaret-style show called Festfolk, which introduced them as a group to wider audiences. Reviews were mixed, but even then, audiences responded to the magic of their vocal harmonies. The four kept collaborating throughout 1971 and 1972, supporting each other's solo careers while continuing to experiment as a team. In 1972, they released People Need Love, credited not to ABBA, but to Bjorn and Benny, Agnetha and Anni-Frid. It was a modest success, reaching the Swedish charts and even gaining attention abroad. Though small, it was proof that their voices together carried something irresistible. Behind the music, love was the glue. Benny and Frida, Bjorn and Agnetha, they weren't just bandmates, they were couples in love, building families while chasing their dreams. And that intimacy lent an authenticity to their music. When they sang about love, longing, or joy, it wasn't just performance, it was their real lives pouring through every note. What none of them could have predicted at the time was just how far this experiment would take them. The two couples had unknowingly laid the foundation for what would soon become a global phenomenon, a group that would stand as one of the most successful and beloved acts in music history, ABBA. By 1973, the four musicians were no longer just experimenting with joint projects. They were becoming a true group. Their big step forward came with Ring Ring, a bright and energetic song entered into Sweden's Melodifestivalen, the competition to select the country's entry for Eurovision. Many expected it to win, but to the group's disappointment, it finished only in third place. Still, Ring Ring turned out to be a breakthrough. The single and album became hits across Europe, topping charts in several countries and even reaching as far as South Africa. The song also revealed something important. The combination of Agnetha and Frida's voices, framed by Benny and Bjorn's songwriting, had global appeal. The chemistry was undeniable, and it was clear they were destined for something bigger. At this time, their manager Stig Andersson argued that the group needed a shorter, more memorable name. Bjorn and Benny, Agnetha and Annie Frid was too long to fit on record covers or posters. His solution was simple but clever. Take the first letters of each member's name and put them together. ABBA. The fact that ABBA was also the name of a well-known Swedish fish canning company only added to its quirky charm. After receiving permission from the company, the band embraced the name wholeheartedly. Soon after, their identity was strengthened further with the creation of the mirrored B in their logo. During a photo session, Benny accidentally held his letter backwards. The result looked bold and stylish, and the group decided to adopt it permanently. That mirrored B became one of the most recognizable symbols in pop history. By the end of 1973, ABBA had a name, a style, and a sound that was uniquely theirs. They were no longer four separate artists occasionally working together. They were a band. All they needed now was the right song and the right stage to launch them beyond Sweden. That moment would arrive in 1974 with a single word that would change everything: Waterloo. In 1974, ABBA stood at the edge of destiny. After the modest success of Ring Ring, they knew they had the talent, but they still needed that one perfect song to break through on the world stage. Benny and Bjorn began working feverishly, determined to craft a track that was bold, catchy, and impossible to forget. What emerged was Waterloo, a glam-influenced anthem bursting with energy and charm. The group entered Waterloo into Melodifestivalen, and this time they were ready. Agnetha and Frida dazzled with their powerful harmonies, while Benny and Bjorn's musicianship added polish and drive. On February 9, 1974, they won the Swedish selection, securing their ticket to the Eurovision Song Contest in Brighton, England. When ABBA stepped onto the Eurovision stage on April 6, dressed in flamboyant costumes and brimming with confidence, they electrified the audience. Their performance of Waterloo was theatrical, joyous, and unforgettable. Against stiff competition, they triumphed, becoming the first Swedish act ever to win Eurovision. That victory was the spark that lit a global fire. Waterloo topped charts in 9 countries and stormed into the US top 10, reaching number 6. Suddenly, ABBA was no longer just a Swedish success story. They were an international sensation. Yet fame came with challenges. Their follow-up single, Honey Honey, performed well in some markets, but in the UK, their label chose to re-release Ring Ring instead, leading critics to wonder if ABBA might be just another Eurovision one-hit wonder. The group pressed on, touring across Europe, though not every venue sold out. Some shows even had to be cancelled. But in early 1975, their perseverance began to pay off. Songs like SOS and Mamma Mia became major hits, especially in Europe and Australia. In Australia, thanks to constant television exposure, ABBA fever exploded, with Mamma Mia sitting at number 1 for 10 straight weeks. By 1976, it was undeniable. ABBA wasn't going anywhere. They had proven they were not only Eurovision winners but true global superstars, capable of shaping the sound of an entire era. Waterloo had opened the door, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would soon take them higher than they ever imagined. By 1976, ABBA had fully cemented their place as international stars. Their greatest hits album soared in the UK, driven by the new single Fernando, which became one of their biggest sellers worldwide. Later that year came Arrival, the album that defined their peak, with tracks like Money Money Money, Knowing Me, Knowing You, and most famously Dancing Queen. ABBA conquered the charts. Dancing Queen became their signature song, reaching #1 not only across Europe, but also in the United States, a rare feat for a non-English-speaking act at the time. ABBA were no longer just Eurovision winners. They were global icons. Their mix of glamour, infectious melodies, and polished production made them one of the most recognizable groups of the decade. With Dancing Queen dominating the airwaves, ABBA launched into ambitious tours across Europe, Australia, and later North America. In 1977, their concerts drew massive crowds, tens of thousands braving storms, even bomb threats, just to see them live. In Australia, the frenzy was so overwhelming it inspired the semi-documentary ABBA the Movie. But behind the glittering stage lights, pressures mounted. Constant travel, media attention, and the strain of balancing family life with relentless fame began to take their toll. Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage grew fragile under the spotlight, while Benny and Frida also began to feel the weight of success pressing on their relationship. The tours proved ABBA could command the world's biggest arenas, but they also revealed the cracks forming beneath the surface, cracks that no hit single could fully repair. By the late 1970s, ABBA's music was still topping charts, but the lives of its members were beginning to fracture. The immense pressure of fame, endless touring, and time away from family were taking a toll. What had once seemed like two fairy tale romances at the heart of the band was unraveling. In 1979, Bjorn and Agnetha announced their separation. Their marriage had endured years of stress, complicated by the constant public attention. For fans, the news was heartbreaking. ABBA wasn't just a band. They were couples whose love stories felt woven into the music itself. Many listeners could not separate songs like The Winner Takes It All from Agnetha's own pain, even though both she and Bjorn insisted the lyrics were not strictly autobiographical. Still, the song carried raw emotion, and its delivery only strengthened the perception that the music mirrored their personal lives. Just 2 years later, in 1981, Benny and Frida followed a similar path. Their marriage had been troubled for some time, and Benny had already fallen in love with another woman, Mona Nurklet, whom he would later marry. Frida admitted that she and Benny had grown apart, and though they tried to remain friends, the emotional weight of the divorce added further tension to the group. In the midst of these heartbreaks, ABBA continued to create. Their 1981 album, The Visitors, marked a stark departure from the joyful, carefree pop that had made them famous. It was darker, more mature, and thematically complex. Songs dealt with loneliness, failed relationships, political unease, and aging. The title track evoked a sense of secrecy and oppression, reflecting a world moving into uncertain times. Critics praised the album for its depth, calling it ABBA's most sophisticated work. Commercially, it was successful in Europe, topping charts in several countries, though it struggled to match earlier numbers in markets like the US and Australia. For many fans, however, The Visitors felt like a goodbye letter, an acknowledgement that the magic of the early years had given way to personal struggles too heavy to ignore. By the end of 1982, the group released the singles The First 10 Years, a compilation that included 2 new tracks, The Day Before You Came and Under Attack. These songs, poignant and bittersweet, became ABBA's final releases before the band quietly stepped away from the spotlight. The golden era of ABBA had come to an end. The glittering costumes and worldwide tours were over, but the songs they created during this turbulent time, born out of love, loss, and resilience, would only grow in power with each passing decade. When ABBA stepped off the stage in 1982, there was no dramatic breakup announcement, just a quiet fade into separate lives. For Benny and Bjorn, the transition was smoother. Their creative partnership remained strong, and together they launched new projects that showed their songwriting was far from finished. The most notable was the 1984 musical Chess, which produced hits like One Night in Bangkok, and proved that the duo could succeed outside of ABBA's shadow. Years later, they would also shepherd the stage musical Mamma Mia and its blockbuster film adaptation, ensuring ABBA's music lived on for new generations. For Agnetha, the years after ABBA were far more difficult. Struggling with stage fright, a fear of flying, and the lingering pain of her divorce, she withdrew from public life. She released solo work sporadically, including the tender album My Coloring Book in 2004, but mostly chose a quiet existence away from the spotlight. Frida, too, stepped back, though her life took dramatic turns. After marrying into German royalty in the 1990s, she suffered immense personal losses, including the tragic death of her daughter and later her husband. Despite this, she found resilience, supported by faith and the tranquility of life in Switzerland. By the 1990s, demand for a reunion had reached fever pitch. Rumors swirled constantly, and offers including a jaw-dropping $1 billion for a global tour were turned down. For years, fans believed ABBA would never return. The group appeared together only at rare events like the premieres of Mamma Mia. Then in 2018, the unthinkable happened. The four members reunited in the studio. What was planned as 2 new songs grew into a full album, Voyage, released in 2021. The project was accompanied by the groundbreaking ABBA Voyage digital concert in London, where holographic avatars of the band performed as they looked in their 1970s glory. The show became a massive cultural event, drawing millions of fans and proving ABBA's enduring relevance. And in May 2025, during the 3rd anniversary of the Voyage show, Benny and Frida surprised fans by appearing together in London, standing side by side once again. Their presence, warm words and easy laughter reminded the world that while marriages had ended and decades had passed, the bond between the 4 members of ABBA remained unbreakable. The story of ABBA after their breakup was not just about separation, but about survival, reinvention, and the quiet endurance of friendship and respect. The music never left, and neither, it seems, did the spirit of the band that once made the whole world dance.